Someone knows who's done it. And I know people must be frightened, but they've got to think that they can't leave this killer out there. It could be their son, could be their brother next time, because it'll happen again. If he's not caught, it'll happen again.
Just yards from the M25 motorway, a murder hunt is underway after what appears to have been an horrific attack of so-called road rage.
A man's been stabbed to death after an argument with another driver. Police are describing the attack.
21-year-old Stephen Cameron from Swanley was killed in front of his girlfriend during an argument on a motorway slip road.
But what was your aim in all that?
He was lying in like a pool, literally a pool of blood.
I remember just thinking, what am I going to say? What do you say to his mum or dad?
I think I was just in disbelief. I couldn't comprehend what he'd said. I didn't even question what he said. I don't even think I spoke.
You couldn't touch him. He wasn't yours anymore. He was a crime scene.
It seems that this police investigation is now focusing on the killer being somebody who was aged between 13 and 15, just a few years older than the child that they killed.
11-year-old Rhys Jones lived on the Croxteth Park estate in Liverpool.
Croxteth Park estate, which is predominantly housing estates. There's something like 3,000 privately owned houses. And in the middle of the estate is the Fir Tree pub. And then very close by is the only block of shops on that estate, with a medical centre, a school and a church nearby.
We'd lived on that estate for 17 years. I've never felt unsafe. It's a lovely area that we live in.
Obviously seeing groups of kids knocking around, but, you know, nothing more than what you do as a youngster yourself, you know.
It's a really lovely looking estate. You know, you drive on it and there's trees, there's woods, there's plenty of greenery. All the houses are nice. With it being private, everyone has a bit more pride in their homes, and it's a lovely looking place.
I'd never had any worries about letting the boys go out and play. We've never had any trouble up there.
Although it's a massive estate, I would say it was quite close, really, because there's only a little block of shops, and obviously that's the centre point of the estate. I think most people know each other.
Rhys lived with his mother, Mel, father, Steve, and older brother, Owen. It was a happy family life, where Rhys was thriving.
We were just like a normal family, you know. Steve works permanent nights. I had a little part-time job. The boys were both at school and both doing really well. Weekends were always a bit special because Steve was always off on a weekend, and we always make sure we do things together as a family.
We gave him every encouragement to go out and, you know, be active and have a good time.
Rhys was a popular personality and loved by family and friends alike.
Rhys was a very happy and energetic little boy. He was also very funny and just a really outgoing little boy.
He's one of those lads that you couldn't be mad at for very long. And even if you were mad at him, he'd just make you laugh. He's just lovable and likeable.
Rhys was, he was cheeky little lad. He was always smiling, always laughing.
He was always playing tricks, and he was dead mischievous. He'd always make mud balls and start throwing them at the kids, and then all the other kids would join in, and I'd just be tearing my hair out like shouting at him, you know.
But Rhys's biggest passion was football.
I think the passion for football that he has took up all of his life. It was just football, football, football. Played for the Fir Tree for about 12 months. I think he played his first season. He was going into playing his second season for them.
He was a good footballer. You could see it from an early age. He could kick the ball further than other kids of his age, and you could see that there was something special about him.
The 22nd of August 2007 was a warm and sunny day, and for the Joneses family, it started like any other weekend.
I'd been to work in the morning. I came home and Rhys was starting senior schools in September, so we said I'd just go to town and get him his new uniform.
I worked permanent nights, so I'd been in bed most of that day, and I got up round about tea time. Obviously, I had my tea. Rhys, I knew, was going to go and train.
He'd go training once a week and he'd play a match of a weekend.
We decided that we would get together for an extra training session because the season was due to start on the following Sunday.
But he was more excited because England were playing that night as well. So there was quite a buzz going around in the house because he wanted to get back for the match. He just had a light snack and then he just went up and put his kit on.
Rhys left home and made his way to football.
Rhys always used to take himself to training. As you come out of our house, it'd be a 5-7 minute walk on one straight road straight up to the football pitches behind the shops.
The training ground would have been just to the right and slightly set back behind the pub. More or less right next to it, really.
Soon after arriving at football practice, Rhys realised he'd forgotten something.
The training session on that particular evening started about 6 o'clock. I'd asked all the kids to get there. Rhys had forgot his £5 signing on fee. And he went, "Oh, I forgot my money." And you could see him start to panic a little bit. And before I could even say anything off, he'd gone. He'd run home. Rhys!
I was sitting on the settee watching the TV when he came bursting back through the door because he'd forgotten the sign-on money. Obviously, he badgered Mel, and he just sat on the end of the couch waiting patiently for her to give him the money.
Instead of just leaving it and paying next time, he wouldn't. So I gave him his signing on fee, and because he was going to be late, I put him in the car and I drove him the couple of minutes up the road to the training field. He just kissed me on the cheek and said, "Ta-ra, Mum, I'll be home to watch England."
With his subs fully paid, Rhys finally joined his teammates.
We'd done a couple of little warm-up things, you know, we'd run round the field, then we'd do a couple of little stretching exercises. You know, there was just a couple of little exercises like that. But we never really spent much time doing that because I always thought it's better if kids are playing football rather than, you know, doing exercises.
After a successful training session, Rhys was ready to make his way home, looking forward to watching England play Germany that evening.
I was at the back of the car with the boot open, putting stuff in, and Rhys walked past the front of the car. And he said, "Ta-ra." And I said, "Where are you going? How are you getting home?" So he said, "It's all right, I'll walk." I asked Rhys to get in the car 2-3 times. And I even said to him, "No, come on, get in the car, I'll drop you off, it's no problem. Come on." And Rhys was adamant he was walking.
Hey, Rhys!
It was a pleasant evening as Rhys made his way home, a journey he had made countless times before, but one that would be his last.
The 22nd of August was a hot summer's evening. The pub was very busy.
On that particular evening, England were playing Germany. A lot of people who were sat outside because of the nice weather and also because of the smoking ban. And Rhys at that time had finished his football practice and was walking a relatively short distance home from the football field.
I jumped in my car and I drove probably 50 yards and Sean was in the passenger seat and he screamed out Rhys's name. And I looked back. I've seen Rhys hit the floor and I knew immediately he was hurt. The first thing that entered my head was he slipped. So I slammed the brakes on in the car and I jumped out. But by the time I'd done that, Sean had opened the door and jumped out. So he got to Rhys before I did. Just before I got there, a girl got there. She worked in the pub. This girl had grabbed hold of Rhys. She was trying to administer some sort of first aid. He was lying in like a pool, literally a pool of blood. The girl was shouting to me, he's been shot.
Call an ambulance!
It's just that bit, seeing him. Sean was hysterical.
Call an ambulance!
So I'm shouting to Sean, he'll be all right, but I just froze, I was numb, I couldn't have done anything at all. The first thing I done was get my phone out and I phoned the ambulance and the police. And all the time, Sean's running around hysterical, and I'm trying to say to Sean, he'll be okay, don't worry.
A distressed Steve didn't have Rhys's home number, so he frantically called local resident and fellow Third Tree football coach, Tony Edge.
I could hear the panic in his voice, and he said, Tony, I don't know what to do. Rhys has been shot.
I started to shout a little bit. Just get round there and get his mum and get her here now, immediately.
I remember just thinking, what am I going to say? What do you say to his mum or dad when they answer the door?
Rhys's football coach, Tony, raced over to the Jones family home.
Well, I was just sitting on the settee watching the telly and there was a knock at the door. And I just opened the door and Tony was just standing there.
I said, Steve just rang me and he said Rhys has been shot, but I don't know how bad it is. That's all I know.
And he just went, you just need to come with me now. And I didn't even have time to think, I just ran into the living room, grabbed my keys and my phone, and I just got in the car.
Well, the distance from Rhys's house to the pub car park, about a minute in the car. We were just really in silence and we were just wanting to get there as soon as possible.
I think I was just in disbelief. I couldn't comprehend what he'd said. I didn't even question what he said. I don't even think I spoke.
A stunned crowd had already started to gather round Rhys.
It seemed like there was hundreds of people all around. I couldn't see anything at first. I got out the car and I just heard someone shout, "Here's his mum." And then as I heard that voice, all the people that were together just sort of stood apart and Rhys was just on the floor. And I just ran over. I couldn't really even see where he was hurt. I could just see the pool. He was lying in a pool of blood. I just put my hand under his head and I was like, "Come on, Rhys, you're going to be okay, come on. You're going to be okay, I'm here now, it's going to be fine." And people were screaming and where's the ambulance? But I was just, "Come on, Rhys, just look at me, you'll be all right."
Tony never went over to Rhys. He left Mel and Tony come over to me and I was sort of trying to explain to Tony what had happened.
When I saw Steve, he was distraught, he was in tears and, he's probably thinking if we hadn't have had training that night, it wouldn't have happened.
It felt like an eternity till the ambulance arrived. It just felt like an eternity. I was still there, still holding on to him. And then when the paramedics arrive and they're working on him, and I just wanted them to help Rhys. I just wanted them to save him.
I think I was on the M57 driving along when I got a call off Mel. And it was a very, very short call just saying that, "Steve, you need to come home. Rhys has been shot." And the first thing that went through my mind was that some kids had an air rifle or an air pistol and they, let off a pellet or something and it struck him and lodged him or whatever it was. I didn't, for one instant, think that it was a proper firearm that he'd been shot with.
When we got to the hospital, everyone was there waiting for us. They're all working on them and there's a whole team of people and you're thinking, it's going to be okay, they're going to... And they allowed me and Steve to go in and we were rubbing his legs and took took his boots off, rubbing his feet, and they were telling us to talk to him, and while they were all working on him, and I'm thinking, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, because they know what they're doing and they can see him, but they tried so hard, didn't they?
The doctors desperately tried to save Rhys, but the young boy tragically never regained consciousness.
I think the hardest thing for us was leaving Rhys in the hospital. We didn't want to go home and leave him there.
You couldn't touch him. He wasn't yours anymore. He was a crime scene.
And we just went home in shock. Rhys, you know, we just went home and we were just sitting in Rhys's room and we just all started crying. We couldn't understand what's happened.
At 6 o'clock, the murder of an 11-year-old boy in Liverpool.
He was shot by another youth on a BMX outside the Fir Tree pub in Croxteth.
He was shot in the neck last night in Croxteth on his way home from football practice. He died later in hospital. And the police say
knows who this killer is. This is not a time for silence. Do the right thing and turn them in.
As the shooting made headline news, across the country there was stunned disbelief. Merseyside police quickly mobilised, determined to find the schoolboy's killer.
It's probably one of the largest murder investigations that Merseyside police has run. The fact that he had no involvement and was an innocent victim in the middle of all this. You know, the pressure was there to solve this offence and to bring the people or person responsible to justice. There's a large number of detectives who were deployed immediately onto it to conduct the outside inquiries. You've got the incident room itself, there's a lot of search teams involved, all the scientists, crime scene investigators.
In the early hours of the investigation, it was clear to the police that the shooting was gang-related.
On the Croxteth estate. The Croxteth Park estate itself is about less than a mile from the old Croxteth council estate. We were aware that there was gangs in mainly the old Croxteth estate.
You've got a situation in Liverpool 11 where, in effect, two close-knit geographical locations, which is Croxteth and Norris Green, are separated, in effect, by one road. And over the years, there has been a number of incidents involving almost like conflict between these two groups, which had escalated and had started to actually use guns.
We were aware of certain things that had gone on in the past, you know, between, you know, Norris Green and Croxteth crew and stuff like that, but, you know, we'd never been a part of it, we never witnessed any of it. We just never thought that it'd overspill onto, you know, our estate.
The whole scenario of there being gangs on the estate and young boys having guns just seemed a world away from the life that we were living. I just couldn't comprehend it.
I just wanted to understand. I just wanted to know what had gone on, why someone could shoot an 11-year-old boy. Because I knew that Rhys didn't hang around with those type of people. You know, all his mates were all just good lads.
The very next day, Rhys's parents conducted a press conference, pleading for witnesses.
Someone knows who's done it. And I know people must be frightened, but they've got to think that they can't leave this killer out there. It could be their son, could be their brother next time, because it'll happen again. If he's not caught, it'll happen again.
Witnesses who were near to the scene at the time of the shooting began to come forward. They described a crucial piece of information. They saw a teenage boy riding a bike.
There were 3 shots fired in total by the gunman on the night. The first one was aimed at 2 lads who were riding their bikes across the pub car park. They then rode off on their bikes, and he's obviously tracked them, aiming at them again. and has fired a second time. That bullet struck Rhys, and then amazingly the gunman continued and fired a further shot, the third shot, still obviously tracking his intended target at that time, even though clearly Rhys had already fallen to the floor, having been struck.
There was eyewitnesses who told us they'd seen the gunman, but unfortunately none of those were able to identify him.
The police then obtained a vital clue: CCTV footage of the killer on his bike.
The significant piece of CCTV footage that we had and was used in this case was that taken from the pub system itself. That showed the gunman obviously approaching from the rear and going to either side of the pub. At that stage, he's clearly looking for his intended victims. You see him come back across the rear of the pub, and he then comes out the other side, which is at the point where he stood astride his bike and fired his weapon 3 times.
When the gunman left the scene, we knew that he'd driven through the Croxteth Park estate on his bike. He'd crossed over Fir Tree Drive North and was narrowly missed by passing traffic, and across into Dam Wood, which is a wooded area that separates Croxteth Park and the old Croxteth estate.
Unfortunately, it wasn't that clear with regards to the face of the gunman. But what it did give us, which is quite crucial, was the actual dimensions of the bike.
As the killer made off with the gun, the pressure was now on the police to locate the gunman, bike and the murder weapon.
It was important to identify the offender at an early stage. Obviously, there's a youth out there who's armed, could well use that gun again.
Everyone was just staying inside, that, you know, because people were frightened. People were frightened that it was going to happen again, you know, because if it could happen to Rhys, it could happen to absolutely anybody.
I think the circumstances of Rhys being shot and killed created an element of fear, and rightly so, within the community. People knew that we hadn't arrested the offender. You've got to put yourselves in the position of a parent living in that location and thinking that could have been my child.
You do have an instinct to keep your children safe, especially after something like that's happened. The streets around here were empty of kids.
People on the estate were obviously very protective of their young children. It certainly changed my view on where Sean could go and who he'd play with. I wouldn't let him go 2-3 streets away on his own. If he was going round to his friends, I'd drop him off there and I'd pick him up.
In the early stages of the murder investigation, the police already had a prime suspect. Postings on a social networking site had already named one boy as the alleged killer, 16-year-old Sean Mercer.
You did hear teenagers saying things, and obviously Mercer's name was all over the internet that night.
Mercer had a number of previous convictions, only a small amount for relatively minor crime. There was an ASBO in force against him at the time, but he was well known to the local police as being one of the youths who caused trouble, and he was related to the Croxteth crew.
Rhys was shot on the evening of Wednesday, the 22nd of August. By the Friday, what we had then was a number of pieces of information and intelligence that had come into us to suggest who the potential suspects were in this. By the Saturday, so you're talking 3 days after the murder of Rhys, a number of arrests were made on the morning. Sean Mercer was arrested on that day with a lad by the name of Dean Kelly, as was James Yates.
Mercer, because we thought he was the gunman, was put on an identification parade, and 5 witnesses who'd actually seen the gunman fire the gun across the car park were asked to attend that parade. None of them were able to identify Mercer as the gunman. When Mercer was initially interviewed, he gave a prepared statement through his solicitor, which said He'd been in the company of Dean Kelly, a friend of his, at the relevant time. He also said in that statement that the 2 bicycles we recovered from his house on the Saturday morning were the only bikes that he had. None of those 2 bikes matched the bike that we'd seen on the CCTV of the offender.
The Croxteth crew gang closed ranks around Sean Mercer. Even his mother, Jeanette Mercer, who was present at the police interview, vouched for her son. At this stage in the investigation, there simply wasn't enough evidence to categorically prove Mercer was the murderer.
We know that if these people are going to try and, cover the tracks and hide, we know it's going to be difficult. We know it's going to be a long, hard slog. We just thought, well, we're in for a long haul here.
There was an element of silence around the actual offender, but only carried out by the people who knew and assisted him at the relevant time.
With no actual eyewitness, no murder weapon and no bike, Merseyside police had no choice but to release Mercer and his accomplices back into the community.
It was frustrating letting Mercer go. Everything at that stage was pointing towards him being responsible for the murder of Rhys. And we knew at that stage that it was going to be quite a long and protracted inquiry.
The name of the offender is being mentioned in the community and was quite widely known.
I mean, we specifically asked that we didn't want to know any names from the onset, as that, because there was a lot of rumours going around. There was a lot of, the reasons why and how and stuff like that.
Personally, we didn't want to know. We knew there was names being bantered about, but we didn't want to know until that person was actually charged with Rhys's murder. We didn't want to know.
We had to get the evidence sufficient to charge and build an appropriate case to put before the Crown Court. We just can't put people away whilst we gather the evidence.
If you're the killer and you're watching this, turn yourself in. Similarly, if you know who is the gunman or who put the gun in his hand, do the right thing.
And I think if someone had walked into a police station and held a hand up and said, I'm the person responsible, or, I'm in connection with it, then, it makes things a lot easier, not only for the police, but obviously for us.
On the 6th of September 2007, thousands of mourners gathered at Liverpool's Anglican Cathedral for the funeral service of Rhys Jones. With emotions running high, the pressure was on Merseyside police to find the gun and the missing bike, which would crucially link prime suspect Sean Mercer to the crime scene. In a desperate bid to uncover the alleged killer's movements, the police turned to mobile phone intelligence.
There was 2 calls made to Mercer before the murder of Rhys, and obviously what we would infer from that is that they were calls to say that the intended victim was in the area.
Police used Mercer's phone logs and CCTV footage to establish the sequence of events around the time of the murder.
He left on his bike just after 6 o'clock, and from there he went into the old Croxteth estate, where he was captured on a number of CCTV cameras riding his bike, and we believe he actually collected the gun that he used to kill Rhys from James Yates's girlfriend's house on Croxteth estate.
We established that the offender, having taken possession of the gun, he then went and carried out the shooting, obviously striking Rhys in that process.
Following the shooting, Mercer rode off to the home of a 15-year-old boy, referred to as Boy M.
We believe Mercer chose Boy M's house for a number of reasons. A, it was the closest of his associates to the Croxteth Park estate, so he could get there quickly and get off the streets as quick as possible. And also, Boy M was only 15 years old at the time, and while not a member of the Croxteth crew, he had been involved in gang activity. He was young, he had behavioural problems himself, and Mercer knew he could tell Boy M what to do, and Boy M would do it.
It was from Boy M's house that Mercer hatched his plan.
Mercer made a series of telephone calls to his associates, and effectively he called his gang members in to assist him, and they helped by making plans to dispose of the gun, dispose of his clothing, douse him in petrol to get rid of any forensic evidence, and also to get rid of the bikes. It's a belief that petrol will dispose of any of the residue that's discharged from a firearm when you've been in close proximity to it being fired.
But which of the Croxteth crew gang members were involved? Melvin Coy, age 24.
He made a phone call to Mercer about 20 to 7, informing him of the people being present from the opposing group.
Gary Kays, age 24.
He made a phone call to Sean Mercer just before 7:10 to alert him to the fact that members of the opposing group were in the area on the pub car park.
James Yates, age 19.
James Yates was an associate of Sean Mercer, and he had actually given the gun to Mercer on the night in question.
Nathan Quinn, age 16.
He attended at the friend's address with James Yates immediately in the aftermath of the shooting of Rhys.
Dean Kelly, age 16.
He's a friend of Mercer, who he was actually with at the time when Mercer was arrested 3 days after the murder of Rhys. Dean Kelly, at that point, gave an alibi, in effect, for Sean Mercer.
On the night of the murder, Mercer, Yates and Quinn got into Melvin Coy's Ford Galaxy. They drove probably 1.5 miles, 2 miles to the Kirby Industrial Estate where Melvin Coy had access to a lockup, and it was there that Mercer's clothes were burnt and Mercer was cleansed of any firearms residue using petrol. And as a result of examining CCTV, we were able to identify Melvin Coy's Ford Galaxy entering the estate. We did execute a search warrant there. The only things of significance that we found in that lockup were 3 empty petrol cans.
Having quite clearly established Sean Mercer's movements, the police needed to trace what had happened to the murder weapon.
As a result of intelligence that we'd received, a search warrant was executed at the home address of Boy X. In the loft, we recovered a Smith & Wesson revolver, a self-loading pistol and ammunition that fitted both of those guns.
The type of residue that was recovered by the forensic scientists from the gun matched the residue that was recovered from Rhys's football shirt that he was wearing at the time.
Boy X was arrested and interviewed.
He gave us an account that Mercer had phoned him, told him to come to Boy M's house, went into the house and was confronted by Mercer, who gave him the package and told him to take it back and hide it. Now, Boy X was petrified. He felt intimidated by Mercer.
Mercer called Boy X because he knew of him and knew him from the area, but Boy X was not a member of the same group that Mercer was. Boy X took the gun to his home address and he left it in the back garden. And then on the Sunday, another associate of the main offender moved that gun into the loft of Boy X's address.
With such a crucial statement, Merseyside Police took the unusual decision to file an application with the Crown Prosecution Service to offer Boy X immunity.
The use of that legislation is very, very rare, and particularly where a youth is concerned. Witness testimony from Boy X was a major part in the inquiry.
The evidence was slowly mounting against Mercer and his gang. As the police were waiting to hear back from the CPS, they still needed to track down a vital missing piece of the evidence that would bring Mercer to justice.
The bike that Mercer had used, we knew had gone back to his home address later that evening from witness accounts. But from his home address, we didn't know where it had gone, and it remained outstanding.
The police launched a fresh appeal to help trace the bike.
Following our press appeal, a member of the public came forward and said that he'd been cycling himself in the Kirby area near to the industrial estate, and he'd found the bike frame minus its wheels and taken it back. Forensic examination of the bike revealed Mercer's DNA on the bike itself.
Mercer's mother, knowing that he had possession of that bike, she deliberately misled the police during the search by saying that bikes that we recovered at the offender's home address were the only bikes that he owned, and she repeated that fact during later police interview. There's a huge difference between even believing that her son had done it and actually deliberately lying during police interviews, during the police search, and quite clearly trying to frustrate the police investigation.
We'd recovered the bike frame, we'd recovered the gun, and we had other witness accounts which basically blew Mercer's alibi away.
All that remained was a decision from the Crown Prosecution Service on Boy X. In April 2008, the CPS had made their decision.
When the Attorney General had made the decision that Boy X was going to be offered immunity from prosecution, within days we re-interviewed Boy X, obtained his witness account. He entered into the agreement with the Crown Prosecution Service that he would give truthful evidence in return for the immunity from prosecution.
On the 15th of April 2008, Merseyside police arrested 14 people, including Sean Mercer, James Yates, Gary Kays, Melvin Coy, Dean Kelly, Nathan Quinn, and Boy M.
And they were subsequently charged, Mercer with the murder of Rhys and the others with assisting him to dispose of evidence. When Mercer was arrested on the 15th of April, he was interviewed again. He produced a prepared statement in which he denied any involvement in the murder of Rhys and chose not to answer any further questions. Gary Kays and Melvin Coy basically denied being involved in assisting Mercer. The others, when they were interviewed, there was a mixture of people choosing not to answer questions, saying no comment.
As well as the Croxteth crew gang members, a number of adults were also arrested.
Because we knew Jeanette Mercer had lied to us when she'd made witness statements, saying that Sean Mercer had only had the 2 bikes we'd recovered from the house, and because she had possession of his mountain bike on the night of the murder, a decision was made to arrest her.
At his house?
She denied any involvement.
Unless someone had taken it.
James Yates's parents, Francis and Marie Yates, were heavily involved in trying to assist Mercer and their own son. We know that Francis and Marie Yates burnt a SIM card that the police failed to find when they'd searched James Yates's house, and that was the SIM card that he'd been using at the time, and that was crucial evidence.
I think it was shocking, sort of like the help that they got, and it wasn't, so much as, Mercer and his mates that sort of like, took him away, whisked him away and doused him with the petrol, got rid of evidence, got rid of the bike and stuff like that. But it's the adults that were involved with it as well.
Almost 14 months after Rhys's murder, the trial took place at Liverpool Crown Court. Sean Mercer pleaded not guilty.
Throughout the trial, Mercer and his 6 associates were in the dock and frequently would be laughing and joking and not listening to what was going on.
And it was an 11-week trial, and it was a terrible ordeal for us to go through and to listen to, and you're scared to let your emotions out because you think if you do, you're never going to stop crying. You're never going to pull yourself together again.
I think it's fair to say that the behaviour of Sean Mercer and all those people in the dock with him at that time was poor, to say the least. This was all done in front of Rhys's mum and dad as well. I think that is unforgivable, but I also think it actually shows the type of people that we're dealing with here.
The jury found Mercer guilty of the murder of Rhys Jones. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison.
Mercer showed no remorse at all. Even when he was sentenced, very little emotion on his face.
He's destroyed us. He's destroyed our life.
In order to get your head around things, you need somebody to be charged. You need somebody to be found guilty. You've got to have a sentence that you feel reflects the enormity of what they've done.
We got justice for Rhys, because as the sentencing goes, you know, Sean Mercer got the maximum what he could get. And in the eyes of the law, we've got justice. But I personally feel life should mean life. He should spend the rest of his life in jail.
These people should realise that, you know, if they're going to go around firing guns and murdering people, then, you know, they should spend the rest of their life in prison.
There does need to be change regarding guns and gangs. But as a parent, I don't know the answers to that. I think the police and the politicians need to sort that out.
I, like any other cop, is going to sit here and say to you that we would like it to be no incidents of gun crime. But unfortunately, there are firearms out there. There are people who are prepared to use them.
Something needs to be done. It could start with tougher sentence and, you know, give the judges the tools to do the job, get these people off the streets, you know, get them to learn the lesson that, you know, if you're going to get caught with a gun, you're going to end up with a hefty sentence, and, you know, and make them serve that sentence.
But Rhys's death would not be in vain.
We've set a charity up in Rhys's name. It's the Rhys Jones Memorial Fund. The charity is to raise enough money to build a much-needed community centre in Croxteth Park, where we live. Somewhere for all the kids to go, keep them off the streets, keep them busy, give them an interest.
I work quite closely with Steve Gagan, which is, we do a soccer competition each year for the kids. Fair Tree take part, you know, the old lads that Rhys used to play football with, and it's a really, really good competition.
Rhys just lived for football. Everything evolved around football. And in terms of keeping Rhys's memory alive, then the most appropriate way to do it is through football.
I just remember Rhys as being a really bubbly, lovable lad. He'd just make you laugh.
I just remember Rhys smiling. He was always smiling, he was always laughing, always joking around. And he was always his most happiest when he was playing football.
He made a come to us quite quick. I told him with the noose, and he hardly struggled.
Initially, it was just gay killer. First victim he picked up in this bar. Where would the next bar be? We didn't know.
The body was laid out on the bed. It was bound. The noose was still around his neck.
His motivation seems to be this quest for infamy, to be a serial killer.
And once he killed them, he actually stayed with them for several hours.
He definitely was a man who needed to be locked away.
By the early 1990s, Soho had established itself as the centre of London's gay scene, and the area's bars, clubs and saunas were able to exist openly and in relative peace. One such venue was the Colhern Arms, a dimly lit bar on Old Brompton Road. It had a reputation for attracting men who were into leather and sadomasochism.
The Colhern back then was the destination venue for gay leathermen in London. The windows were blacked out, so you couldn't see inside. It was quite industrial, the decor inside. You did sometimes see sex on the premises.
Just a throng of people out for a good time to meet up and socialise with each other and to go off together. I mean, it really was a meeting place.
On the 8th of March 1993, 45-year-old Peter Walker, a renowned assistant theatre director working in the West End, visited the Colhern. He was a regular there and openly gay. There were also suggestions that he was interested in the S&M scene. That night, he happened to bump into a man spilling his drink on him. After briefly chatting, the pair soon left together when Peter invited the man back to his Battersea apartment.
One of the tough realities that we as a community of gay men have to take on board is that we do put ourselves into very, very compromised situations where their safety could be at risk. It involves a huge amount of trust. This isn't to say that this is true of everybody, of course it isn't, but there is a sizable minority of gay men who will go out and they will go home with somebody knowing nothing about them. The chances are that not only do you not know them, but also that they're likely to be into bondage.
So we have a situation where Peter Walker has admitted a complete stranger into his flat with his keys, so there's no forced entry, agreed to be tied to a bed frame.
With Peter playing the role of the submissive, the stranger whom he'd just met was about to reveal his true intentions. Far from being there for consensual sex, he was there to kill. With Peter restrained and unable to defend himself, the killer delivered a savage beating before suffocating him with a plastic bag.
He then remained in the flat, cleaning it and just being patient, waiting for the rush hour to begin in the early hours of the morning.
He wiped any surface that he had touched clean of his fingerprints. Moreover, he bagged up his clothing after he'd committed the crime and destroyed it.
And at 7 o'clock, he then left and just mingled out with the crowds and just blended into obscurity.
The killer harboured a terrifying obsession, and only weeks earlier had vowed to become a serial killer in a chilling New Year's resolution. His actions would go on to strike fear into the heart of London's gay community throughout 1993. One of the first detectives to arrive at the scene of Peter Walker's murder was Martin Finnegan.
Got a call from our uniformed colleagues saying they'd been called to a flat down by Battersea. Inside the corridor, there was a room on the left-hand side, the bedroom, and in there, Peter Walker was laying on the bed, covered by a duvet, which had some teddy bears on top, arranged in a 69 position, the two teddies on top. One of the most interesting things there was the ligature marks on his wrists and ankles, and there's no ligatures at the scene. So that raised the idea that whoever had killed him had taken away the ligatures and who knows what else as well.
In fact, the macabre scene that greeted Martin and his colleagues gave police their first indication that they were dealing with a particularly deranged killer. Chillingly, it would be a scene that would be repeated another 4 times before the killer was caught. An early sweep at the crime scene revealed that Peter's bank card was missing from the flat, and upon inspection, police discovered that money had been withdrawn from the account after Peter's murder.
He got into the habit in his early crimes of reimbursing himself for the expense of committing them, and having murdered them, he would go off to a cash point and using their PIN number and their credit card, he then took out, I think in certainly 3 cases, at least £200, I think.
But back in 1993, police were unable to identify who had made those cash withdrawals. And other than this, they had little to go on.
Peter's flat had been meticulously cleaned of any forensic clues by the person who left the flat last. So despite strenuous efforts by our forensic teams there, we were unable to get anything which would positively identify the last person in the flat. So that was frustrating. Our inquiries with his colleagues and friends had come to a natural end. There was really nowhere else for us to go.
Shortly after the discovery of Peter Walker's body, telephone helpline charity The Samaritans received a call from a man concerned about 2 dogs who he claimed were locked in Walker's flat.
The main thrust of his communication was there were some dogs locked up, been there for a couple of days, they need to be released. Oh, and by the way, how do you know that? Well, there's a dead man there. How do you know he's dead? I killed him.
With little forensic evidence at the scene, detectives from the Metropolitan Police quickly realised that they would have to rely on the cooperation of London's gay community to have any chance of catching his killer. But in the early 1990s, the relationship between the LGBTQ community and the police was taut with tension and underpinned by deep fear and suspicion.
Put it this way, when the police have gone to the coal home to try and get information, most of the people in the coal home will have remembered, not long before, 6 months maybe, the police turning up at the Vauxhall Tavern in Vauxhall, where Lily Savage was performing, and raiding the pub wearing rubber gloves in case they caught AIDS off people. So that's the kind of expectation of the police that we had as a community. So if the uniformed officers turning up at a gay venue, automatically people were very, very frightened and very hostile.
Perhaps this inquiry was a catalyst for getting both sides to work together. It was in everyone's interest that Peter Walker's killer was found, and there was no time for posturing as to the rights and wrongs of any sides there. We had work to do. We needed to find this killer, so let's work together.
Police say he'd been suffocated, and marks on his wrists suggest at some stage he'd been tied up.
We actively pursued Peter Walker's death. We left no stone unturned. We made diligent inquiries at the Coleherne pub and amongst the gay community. We built up a deep understanding of how Peter lived his life and his social activities, his sexual activities. So we knew an awful lot about Peter, and that gave us the strongest indication of probably how he met his death, but we didn't have that final link. So that was frustrating. Our inquiries with his colleagues and friends had come to a natural end. There was really nowhere else for us to go. So these inquiries cannot go on forever. There are implications for resources, so we did start scaling the inquiry down. And it was at that point then that other murders started happening.
After 10 weeks, detectives were nowhere nearer to solving the crime. What they didn't know at the time was that the person responsible for Peter's murder held a twisted desire to become a serial killer. His name was Colin Ireland. Ireland was born in 1954 in Dartford in Kent. His natural father walked out on his family shortly after Colin's birth, leaving his mother to bring him up alone. It would be the start of an unsettled and unhappy childhood.
If you look at his childhood, he had a very disturbed childhood. Mother was 17 when she had him, various partners coming in and out, various stepfathers, lots of moves, different schools, very much put into the role of a loner and outsider. Does that explain his behaviour? No, because a lot of other people are unfortunately put in that situation and they don't kill. What we do know is a lot of serial killers have dysfunctional backgrounds, but that's not to say everybody has a dysfunctional background is going to be a killer, because they're not.
Colin Ireland spent much of his formative years in and out of young offenders' institutions and Borstal for various petty crimes.
Colin Ireland's history was that he had no hint that he was into sexual GBHs and assaults. He was a burglar, a bit of fraud, robbery.
After a first marriage that ended following an affair with another woman, Colin Ireland arrived in Devon, where he met his second wife, Janet Young.
I first met Colin when I had a pub. I was a publican in Devon. It was quite amazing, really, his first entrance into the pub. He was a big man and he was dressed in camouflage, although he has never actually been a soldier, although people describe him as that. He never described himself that way. And he stood in the doorway and the whole conversation in the pub just stopped and everybody turned and looked at him. We got talking and we spent nearly the whole night talking. We had quite a lot in common. We got married in January of 1990. We were both really rather control freaks, so I recognised that in him and he in me. And we both wanted the last word in any disagreement, although we didn't argue a lot, but if we were having a debate and so forth, we would all both want the last word.
The problem when you have control freaks, if you don't allow them to have control, then they can lose it. And I would imagine that his wife would have reported cases of incidents where he had lost his temper over something. Because if you break down that control or you challenge that control, they will respond with aggression.
It was late at night and I had a bed and breakfast, and we'd gone to bed and we'd had a discussion, and I had won and he had lost control of me. He threw me out of the bedroom into the hallway where all the guest bedrooms were. So I went into one of the empty guest rooms. He banged on the door and he came into the room and he broke the light bulb so that I couldn't see where he was. And he stood in different corners of the room and called out to me, saying, "I'm over here, I'm over here." Just really frightened me, actually. Didn't touch me, but it was scary.
What they normally do is put enough fear into the partners that the partners don't want to upset them, and then they control them that way. The fear violence is often more powerful than the actual violence.
After marrying, the couple settled down and ran the Globe pub together. When he wasn't working at the pub, Colin would spend his time in Dartmoor, where he developed an interest in the outdoors.
He did like to see himself as a survivalist, and he had all the gear, the water purification tablets and all that kind of thing with him, and he'd go out on the moors and he was going to go all night and catch a rabbit and all this sort of thing. But actually, he wasn't very good at it, and he always came home for his tea.
After only a few months, Colin Ireland had quickly grown tired of married life. During the Easter holiday, Janet visited friends in London, leaving her new husband on his own.
He was due to come and pick me up on the Sunday, and he didn't come, and we assumed that there'd been an accident or something had happened, or a car had broken down. So we phoned the hospitals, we phoned the police, nobody had seen anything of him. We'd cleared my house out, everything went. And then he put my card in the machine and took out every penny that I had. I didn't even have the bus fare to get back from my parents there to lend me the money. I reported him missing, but the police said, well, he's just gone. I went bust. My children and I went into a homeless hostel. It was a nightmare.
Months after leaving Janet and seemingly vanishing from Devon, Colin Ireland resurfaced over 200 miles away in Southend, in Essex. There he quickly acquired work at a homeless shelter.
I was the manager of an emergency night shelter for homeless people in Southend, and Colin was one of a team of volunteers. First impressions of Colin were he's a very big man. He made it quite clear that he'd been to prison. He'd been involved in a robbery at a local cinema and had tied up someone, a manager or someone at the theatre, and gone to prison for it. He did have some rather narrow opinions of certain sections of society. He was homophobic. He made it quite clear that he didn't agree with homosexuality. He didn't like the gay community at all.
Colin's job at the shelter demonstrated his ability to blend in with society and live a seemingly normal life.
One of the interesting things about serial killers is the normality. A lot of them are usually quiet, insignificant people, don't have a history of violence, and people are always shocked. I didn't know him, but he seemed a very nice chap, is what you hear. He's usually insignificant. He's not the kind of guy that when you see walking up the street, you cross the road because you think this one's going to be trouble. He isn't. Most serial killers don't have a very violent personality that's on display. They have violence underneath, but not on display. They're not born evil. They learn about being evil or bad or whatever as part of the way they grow up, part of the world they live in. But he wouldn't have been easily identifiable.
Ireland almost managed to completely hide his dark side from his colleagues at the shelter, but his former co-worker Richard Higgs recalls one occasion in which Ireland appeared to reveal the true extent of his violent capabilities.
On one occasion, we had a particularly troublesome client at the night shelter who kept coming back and causing trouble over and over again. Colin, I assumed, was in jest, suggested one day that he would be able to get rid of him. When I asked him, in a light-hearted way, how, he suggested that he could force a couple of snooker balls down his throat and get rid of him that way.
After a year of working at the night shelter, Colin's colleagues were growing concerned at his increasingly bizarre behaviour.
There had been some allegations during that time of inappropriate touching of some of the female members of staff, and as a result of that, Colin was asked to leave. After Colin left the night shelter, he just used to go off on what we thought were survival weekends. And on those occasions, he used to ask me, or me and my wife, to look after his bag and his belongings because he didn't think they were safe to be left in his bedsit where he lived. In hindsight, it appeared that on those occasions, he wasn't going camping, he was going to London.
Having seemingly got away with the murder of Peter Walker, Ireland's killing spree continued throughout the early part of 1993. And 2 months on from his first murder, Ireland was about to strike again. On the 28th of May, he met 37-year-old librarian Christopher Dunn at the Coleherne. Just like he had done with Walker, Ireland accompanied Dunn back to his flat. Once inside, he tied Christopher to the bed and burnt him with a cigarette lighter until he revealed his PIN number, before strangling him with a length of cord. Afterwards, Colin Ireland once again meticulously cleaned the flat before stealing money from his victim's bank account.
Christopher Dunn lived in Willesden, a single man living alone, and he was found face down, naked on his bed. The pathologist who examined the body said that he wasn't quite sure about the cause of death. It could have been manual strangulation through a sex act, a homosexual sex act had gone wrong.
The uncertainty surrounding the death of Christopher Dunn meant that the inquiry was wound down. Colin Ireland had once again managed to evade the attention of the police. Just a week later, he was ready to kill again.
I think that Colin Ireland picked up his victims at places like the Coleherne was not accidental. Those spaces invited people who were maybe loners, maybe felt cut off from their surroundings, from their neighbours, from their families. So it was harder for the police to trace them. If you're broadcasting your sexual choices by the way you dress, by the code of the way that you look, which kind of proclaims not just that you're gay, but also that you're possibly into S&M and bondage, etc., etc., that kind of provides a very, very fertile hunting ground for somebody who would like to come and do you harm.
The lifestyle lent itself to exploitation. Clearly there's a certain element of trust that needs to go on between consenting people, and in which case this trust was betrayed. Possibly Colin saw the gay community as easy pickings.
On the 4th of June, detectives received news of a third murder. This time, the victim was an American businessman working in London, 35-year-old Perry Bradley.
I was on call as the senior investigating officer. The news of a body having been found in Kensington came in, and we went out to the scene, and that was Perry Bradley. The body was laid out on the bed, it was bound, the noose was still around his neck. There was no obvious sign of any struggle or fight. The crime scene indicated that there were sexual motivations. The way the body was arranged and laid out, it was clearly a little bit unusual. And we were a little bit surprised when we contacted the family and found that there was no apparent history of homosexuality or anything in his background whatsoever.
The confusion about Perry Bradley's sexuality, along with the initial assumption that Christopher Dunn's death may not have been in fact a murder, meant that the Metropolitan Police now had 3 teams separately investigating the crimes of Colin Ireland. And just days later, police would make yet another shocking discovery.
Well, I was on call detective superintendent for murders in the East End of London. I got a call to say that a man called Andrew Collier had been killed.
33-year-old Andrew Collier was a caretaker at a block of flats in northeast London. Openly gay and HIV positive, he was a regular at the Coleherne. It was on a visit there on the evening of the 7th of June that he met Colin Ireland. 2 days later, his lifeless body was discovered in bizarre circumstances in his own flat.
We had an untidy bed, and we had an untidy bedroom, first room on the right, a naked body lying in that position, flat position, head on the pillow, with a cat draped across the body with a condom in the cat's tail, and a condom in the mouth of the cat as well, on the penis of the victim.
Detectives immediately noticed similarities between this unusual scene and the murder of Peter Walker 3 months earlier. Like the previous victim, Andrew Collier's keys were missing and he had been robbed. Inquiries with local officers also provided another crucial breakthrough.
I made inquiries of the local police to see if they'd had any calls at the scene. Had we missed an opportunity for a witness, and we confirmed that there'd been quite a serious street fight about 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. Aware of that, what would you do if you heard noise at 1 o'clock in the morning? You get out of bed and have a look out the window. And when you look out the window in the lounge, there's a bar across Collier's front room, and between the glass of pane and the bar, there was a finger mark facing downwards, and that's a mark that was lifted. So, great bit of forensication done by the officers at that scene.
Until now, Ireland's meticulous attention to detail in cleaning each scene had helped him evade capture. But by leaving a fingerprint in Andrew Collier's flat, he presented the police with their first solid clue to his identity. However, back in 1993, no computerized database of prints existed to search against. Only when a suspect was arrested could comparisons be made. For the time being, Ireland was once again seemingly in the clear. But the different inquiry teams investigating the murders across London were beginning to notice unusual similarities in the crime scenes.
Somebody brought to my notice the circulation concerning the Collier murder at that time, and we looked at it and thought, hey, there's similarities here. I need to talk to Albert about this.
We talked on the phone, we shared crime scene photographs. He was concerned around making a link to the Collier and Walker case.
It became known to me that the method in which Andrew Collier's body had been found was almost identical to Peter Walker's. So, if nothing else, that was a vital link between those two murders.
We fairly quickly, I think, identified Walker, Bradley, Collier and Dunn was a linked series. And we called a meeting of the respective investigating officers. And I remember it very well because we were talking about going over the forensics once again, the bodies, to see if we could find any common factors there, now that we knew it was probably a linked series. And I very well remember the guy from Wealdstone, the Dunn murder, saying, well, that may be a little bit difficult because at this moment, as we speak, he's being cremated. And our hearts sank at that point, but nevertheless, that was the way that Dunn was brought into it. But fortunately, there was quite a lot of information available from the Dunn investigation that we were able to draw upon and pull into our investigations as well.
There are links with all 4 murders, and that was pathologically established this afternoon.
With detectives now sharing intelligence, it became clear that there was a link between the murders of Walker, Dunn, Bradley and Collier. Police grew suspicious that they were in fact dealing with a serial killer, and their suspicions were confirmed when they received a telephone call from an unlikely source.
On Saturday the 12th of June, the CID office at Battersea received a phone call from a man inquiring as to why the Peter Walker inquiry had been wound down, asking were we not interested in the death of a gay man. And he went on to say that he had killed him. He told us that he had already killed Mr. Bradley in Kensington, Christopher Dunn in Wealdstone, and Andrew Collier in Hackney, and said that he was going to carry on, that he wanted to be a serial killer, and that was his New Year resolution, and he carried on until we caught him.
Why are you doing this? But what was your aim in all that?
Once you know you're dealing with a multiple killer, your priorities change, and it's the protection of life then that becomes of absolute paramount importance, because this guy could be out there ready and wanting to kill again.
As a killer, he's unusual in the sense that he's actually broadcasting his behaviour. He was the one that actually was saying, this is what I've done.
I think with most serial killers, there's this element of play and taunting the police. So certainly, he was playing games and he wanted the notoriety. What really frustrated him was the fact that we hadn't made any connections with the first killing, and even the second killing had gone unnoticed, when what he wanted was to be a serial killer. And so this is why he was trying to court the publicity, trying to get us to declare it to be a linked series in order that he could thrive in the publicity.
Detectives were stunned when the man claiming to be the killer called again days later.
To have a killer contacting the authorities twice within a matter of days, making statements like, I killed them, and that was effectively a taunt. Why haven't you caught me yet? I'll carry on, I'll do some more. Again, highly unusual. This is not a man wishing to keep a low profile.
It was during this second phone call that Ireland revealed that he had killed again. He had met Emmanuel Spiteri in a tube station after noticing him at the Colhern on the evening of the 12th of June. The pair had returned to Spiteri's flat, and after stealing his cash card and PIN number, Ireland had strangled him. After Spiteri's landlady discovered his body, police soon established that Emmanuel Spiteri was a regular at the Colhern. They pieced together a route between his flat and the pub and noticed that the most likely way home went through Charing Cross Station, a station that had just been fitted with one of London's first CCTV cameras.
After about 10 hours of viewing, we got the victim, Spiteri, with an image in the background that ended up being Colin Ireland.
The priority was to protect life, and we felt that the image was sufficiently good so that two things might flow from that. A, people would be able to avoid him if he approached them at the Colhern, and B, somebody who knew him well would probably, from the build, even though the facial features were a little bit distorted, from his build, height and general demeanour of the footage, would be able to identify him, and so that triggered us into releasing the information.
After discovering the crucial CCTV footage, police made the decision to release the image. Within days, they were inundated with calls and potential leads, with Gallup, the gay London policing group, taking hundreds of calls.
I think once there was the CCTV footage showing a man, that sort of changed the whole game, really, because suddenly here was somebody that people could see and recognise. And that could have been your next-door neighbour walking along. The phones at Gallup went mad. People were phoning up nearly every day, either saying that they may have information. Was it safe to go to the Colhern? Was it safe to be dressed in leather? I mean, people became really paranoid. There was this real sense of fear within the community.
All sorts of names were propped up that had to be dealt with. So how do you prioritise? Which line of inquiry are you going to deal with first? The pressure was immense, you know. We did go through a very difficult time.
As the Metropolitan Police investigation stepped up, 40 miles away in Southend, Colin Ireland was keeping one eye on detectives' frantic attempts to track him down.
Colin was here. It was the news. They were talking about the gay slayings, as it was called. And Colin turned to me and asked me, he said, you know, what do you think of this then? And my response was, oh, another nutter on the loose. And he just laughed.
As the media tension grew, Colin Ireland could not escape the fact that the net was finally closing in on him.
A couple of his associates, acquaintances, had gone to him and said, hey, Colin, that could be you.
I noticed an identikit picture in a local newspaper. And I thought to myself, you know, oh, it looks like Colin. I didn't pay much attention to it and just generally dismissed it. And of course, when the press turned up, that was one of the things that came to mind. And I realised that, yeah, it was definitely Colin.
As Scotland Yard's massive publicity campaign began to stretch beyond London, Colin Ireland realised the game was up. On July the 19th, he approached his solicitor in Southend and signed an affidavit, admitting that he was the man in the photo, but claiming no knowledge of Spiteri's murder.
He went to a solicitor after seeing his image on television and saying, I am the man in the video, but I'm not the killer. Yes, I did go to Cohen. I met Manuel Spiteri there. He invited me back to his flat in South London. We travelled on the train through Charing Cross. When I got to the front door, there was another man there. I didn't want to have a threesome, so I left immediately and slept in the local churchyard.
Albert Patrick, examining recordings of Ireland's various phone calls, had uncovered a key background noise that originated from Fenchurch Street train station, the line that serves Southend. 2 days later, Ireland's solicitor, under instruction from his client, called the police.
We went to his lawyer's office to speak to him. We obviously arrested him and interviewed him. The crucial thing was that at that point we were able to get his fingerprints, having arrested him.
Police immediately compared Ireland's fingerprints to those found on the window at Andrew Collier's flat. It was a perfect match.
We knew that he had been in the company of Spiteri, that we had a fingerprint of him inside Collier's flat, which he denied ever being to. So that gave us sufficient evidence, and we decided to charge him initially, I think, just with the 2 murders, because what he wanted was the notoriety of being a serial killer. And we felt with him just being charged with the 2 murders, it would cause him quite a bit of frustration. And so that's what we did, and then we waited to see how things developed.
3-4 weeks later, when he was coming back for our hearing at the Magistrates' Court, that's when he said to his escorting officer that he wanted to confess. We had officers to escort him, so they took a brief note of what he was saying on the way back, took him to Edmonton Police Station, where there was a new video system.
For a long time, he denied it and then decided eventually to do it. And that's classic serial killer, is that serial killer keeps all the cards to himself, and then when he realises that the police have most of the cards, he then throws a hand in.
I killed him with the plastic bag. I put that over his head and killed him with that.
He decided to tell all, and he admitted to us the full extent of his involvement.
He made it come to us quite quick. I told him with the news. He hardly struggled. And Sam, for instance, Walker, it took longer.
His interview, I found him willing to talk. I found him articulate and quite happy to provide details. He didn't need much prompting, just a few questions to sort of target his responses, and he was quite happy to talk away.
He was calm, relaxed, you know, he didn't raise his voice.
Tell me about the cat. How did you kill the cat? I stuck a noose around its neck and hung it over a door.
Very factual about his acts, as if he was describing someone else's activities. Absolutely no compassion at all.
Tell me again how Christopher Dunn died. Christopher Dunn, with some cord and manual strangulation.
I didn't detect much hatred at the time. It was just matter of fact. Like, I went down the shops, I bought this, went into this flat and killed him. It was just very matter of fact. A very unusual interview.
Ireland wasn't remorseful. Ireland positively boasted and gloated over the fact that he was a serial killer.
In a series of chilling police interviews, Ireland confessed his crimes in horrifying detail. But investigators were no closer to uncovering his motive and questioned Ireland about his own sexuality.
We questioned Colin Ireland very closely about his sexual orientation, because having moved in gay circles and going home with gay men and murdering gay men after what could have been some sexual activity, it would have made sense had he been gay himself. But throughout all the interviews there, he absolutely refuted any suggestion he was gay, which left the situation that he was even more calculated and cold than we first thought. For a heterosexual to go into a gay area to pick up gay men to kill them is a truly chilling dimension. His motivation seems to be in this quest for infamy, to be a serial killer. That seemed to be what drove him, and he worked at it until he achieved that aim.
It was the victim he was looking for. He was looking for somebody to kill, and gay S&M men are vulnerable in that sense. But he could have easily have killed prostitutes. It didn't really matter to him. It was the killing that was enjoyable. And as far as I understand, he never had sex with any of his victims. There's no evidence at all of any sexual attraction to gay men. So it wasn't homosexual type behaviour. It was simply they were vulnerable.
As well as recounting in extreme detail how he killed his victims, Ireland revealed the true extent of how he was able to ensnare them before murdering them. His ability to convince total strangers to do his bidding was a character trait that those who knew him recognised.
Colin was very manipulative, appeared to be genuine, and as a result was able to convince people to trust him and possibly go along with whatever he was planning at the time.
Perry Bradley was not into sadomasochism or bondage, and Ireland convinced him that this was the only way he could get any gratification, that he, Ireland, could get that. And so Perry Bradley agreed to go along with that, just as an example of his MO. So he was quite chillingly ruthless in the way that he went about his task. And after he'd killed Perry Bradley, he made himself a sandwich and stayed there until the morning when there were more people on the street, and he felt he could more effectively make good his escape and mingle in with the commuters. Very chilling character.
He actually stayed with them for several hours, and that indicates to me somebody who's got an incredible amount of control and being able to sit there, watch television, knowing that you've killed somebody, knowing that you've got to kill time so that you can then make an orderly exit. If he left at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, that would be noticeable. If he leaves at 7 o'clock in the morning, he's just one of the great commuter class and nobody would notice it. That shows a lot of insight into behaviour.
Colin Ireland pleaded guilty to all 5 murders, and he was deemed so dangerous that he was sentenced to 5 life sentences with no possibility of ever being released from prison.
I don't think anybody in court ever actually forget what the judge said, because having detailed the dreadful nature of the way Ireland killed his victims, the judge said to take 1 life is an outrage. To take 5 lives is carnage.
He definitely was a man who needed to be locked away, and he said he was 60% okay, decent guy, and 40% a nudge in him to kill gay men. And I think that's absolutely right.
I think we're all born with the ability to go any direction. We've got all those things in us, good and evil, but our upbringing directs us in one way, and most of us try to be good, and some of us can't. And I think, you know, that he let the bad side of his nature take over, and where most of us fight against that, he let it take him over.
There is an understandable human reluctance to imagine that anybody who can commit crimes of this gravity and this number cannot be normal by any canon that you or I or any other person might understand. The awful truth, I'm afraid, is that there are people who are just plain bad, and Colin Ireland was undoubtedly one of them.
He wasn't mad or insane or psychotic or whatever way we want to describe him. And sometimes people want their killers to be insane because it's easier to cope with it. But when you have somebody who wasn't insane, that's much more worrying, because we could all do that.
Almost 3 decades on from Colin Ireland's terrifying killing spree, as well as making fundamental changes to the way murders are investigated, the police have worked hard to develop a solid, trusting relationship with the gay community.
The fact that we now have LGBT liaison officers, the fact that anti-gay hate crime is actually treated seriously by the police. And I think because of that, the community is much more willing to work with the police when such things happen, which wasn't the case before. 20 years ago, that just wasn't the norm. That was the exception to the norm.
Colin Ireland died of natural causes in Wakefield Prison in February 2012. He was 57. His crimes, however, still linger with the detectives who helped catch him.
My impression of Colin Ireland was absolutely focused on his mission. It was a perverse mission, but one which he carried out with consummate skill, determination. He wanted to have his place in history as a serial killer. That is sadly what he achieved. 5 people lie dead at his hand.
A man's been stabbed to death after an argument with another driver.
It was one of the biggest criminal investigations in terms of resources for the Kent Police that we've ever had.
Got to the roundabout and I just looked at him and I just knew he was dead.
Kenneth Noy is a professional criminal. He has resources and probably money that most of us could only ever dream of.
Police are describing the attack Stephen Cameron from Swanley was killed in front of his girlfriend during an argument on a motorway slip road.
Stephen turned away to walk away and the man went back and got a knife, came back and stabbed him. I just felt my heart was going to come out of my chest. It was just thumping and thumping, and I just couldn't understand, you know, what was going on.
He was kind, generous, funny. He was my best friend.
When your child leaves the house, you wave them goodbye, but you never think you're not going to see them again.
21-year-old Stephen Cameron lived in Kent with his family and worked as an electrician.
He was always teasing everybody. He was a very touchy-feely person. He had a way of coming up behind people and putting his arms around them and cuddling them. He always showed plenty of love.
My Stephen had a fabulous personality. His attitude to life was absolutely fantastic. He was kind, generous, funny. He was my best friend.
He was full of life, great fun to be with, just happy-go-lucky.
Stephen was in a long-term relationship with his childhood sweetheart, 17-year-old Danielle Cable.
Stephen met Danielle when she was at a bus stop, and this is her words to me. He looked at me, smiled at me, and I fell in love with him. And we all had our own lives, but we all were a very close family. We used to see each other all the time and do things together, go away together. We just had a perfect life. You just take it all for granted. It just seemed to us a normal, happy family life.
Stephen and myself, we used to go to golf, go and play pool. Where I worked, that's where Stephen done his training, and I used to see him every day, all day. He was always coming around, and Dad, you haven't got £5 if you want to go and have some lunch. He used to tease the life out of me. We was really, really close.
He was starting his own business with his cousin. They were starting up an electrical business together. Him and Danielle and his best friend, Darren, were moving in together. They'd rented a house in Chislehurst and they had everything to look forward to. He had his life ahead of him and he was so happy.
But this happy family life would soon be shattered. Deep in the heart of the Kent countryside, just 10 miles from the Cameron family home, lived one of Britain's most notorious criminals, Kenneth James Noy. Kenny Noy was already well known to the British police and public, a notorious career criminal involved in the money laundering of the Brinks Mat stolen gold, the largest bullion robbery in British criminal history.
We knew he was a criminal. We didn't know him. We knew there was a book that had been written, the Brinks Mat robbery, which my husband had read and Stephen also had read.
In November 1983, a highly organised South London gang of 6 armed robbers slipped into a maximum security warehouse near Heathrow and stole 3 tons of gold bullion worth a staggering £26 million. It was during the hunt for the missing gold that Kenny Noy was brought to the attention of the police. He was turning the gold into cash. But during the Brinks Mat investigation, he murdered undercover surveillance officer Detective Constable John Fordham in a frenzied knife attack, stabbing the officer multiple times in his chest. Sensationally acquitted on the grounds of self-defense, Noy was instead sentenced to 14 years in prison for his involvement in the conspiracy to handle stolen gold and VAT fraud. He was released early, 7 years later.
Kenneth Noy hadn't long been out of prison. I was unashamed in the way in which he went about his life. He didn't have much shame about the fact that he'd got 14 years in prison for handling stolen goods, the gold from the Brinks Mat.
And this dangerous criminal was to make headline news once more. The 19th of May, 1996, started as a seemingly normal Sunday for the Camerons.
They'd been out the night before and Stephen had been drinking. That morning, I had my 2 little granddaughters staying. They'd got in bed with Stephen and Danielle and was laughing and joking, and he told them that he was going to have them as his bridesmaids, and he was describing to them what sort of dresses they would have. I was up early because my mother, who lived across the road to us, wasn't very well, and she was in bed and I was going to go shopping. Stephen got up and he said, you're going to cook my breakfast, jokingly, and I said no. I said, I'm off out. And he said, oh, come on, Mum, please do my breakfast. I said, no, don't be so lazy, you do it. The last thing he did was tell me he loved me. I left with the 2 granddaughters and took them shopping.
We had a cup of coffee together, had a little chat, told me because he'd been out on the Saturday night to a club with his friends and sort of what have you, and he'd had a good night and what have you. And I think he was a little bit hungover, and so that's why Daniel was driving. And yeah, we had a laugh and a chat and whatever, yeah, as we always did. He said tease the life out of me.
As Stephen and Danielle got ready, they discussed their plans for the day.
Stephen was going up to London to buy some bagels for all his friends. They were all going to a football match that afternoon to watch Danielle's brother play football.
Stephen suggested to Danielle that she drive the Bedford van.
Danielle was driving because they'd been out the night before and Stephen had been drinking.
Danielle, never driven on a motorway in her life. She'd only just passed her test. Stephen decides that, Danielle, you can drive the vehicle, we'll go out and get some shopping. She was very reluctant to do that, but accepted that perhaps to please him she would drive it and get a motorway driving out of the way, as it were, but she wasn't very happy about it, especially a van.
It was on a Sunday, it was about 1:10. I was watching the Monaco Grand Prix. Just started the warm-up lap and Stephen went off with Danielle.
The couple headed towards the motorway at Swanley. In less than an hour, their lives were changed forever.
Stephen was on the phone to his best friend, Darren, who he'd known since he was about 4 and a half. And they were going to share the house together that week they were moving in. They were going to watch Danielle's brother play that afternoon. He also told Danielle he wanted to go and see his goddaughter because he was godfather, and he hadn't seen her for a little while.
They drove down Beech and Lee Lane in Swanley, where they lived, and towards the roundabout near the M25 motorway just a few miles away.
So she drives onto the motorway at the Swanley interchange. We think she'd cut somebody up or had taken someone's road. The Land Rover Discovery pulled across the front of the vehicle when they stopped at the traffic lights just prior to joining the motorway.
Outraged by this late lane change, the motorist stormed out of his vehicle and approached the van. Stephen and Danielle had never seen him before. It was convicted criminal Kenny Noy.
Danielle is in a dreadful state at the driver's wheel of this rascal van.
Terrified, Danielle had no idea why her driving had just triggered such a tirade of abuse from the other motorist. Stephen stepped out of the van and approached the raging driver.
Stephen wasn't even driving. He was just protecting his fiancée, which any man would do.
Stephen Cameron came face to face with Kenny Noy.
What he didn't know at the time, of course, was that the one person that he picked this gesticulation with was Kenneth Noy, a known criminal. There is a confrontation between Stephen and Kenneth Noy at the front of the rascal van, of which Danielle saw the lot.
But the disagreement soon turned to physical violence.
The first punch would appear to have been thrown by Kenneth Noy, but whatever happened, Kenneth Noy was getting the worst of the confrontation that effectively he'd chosen to have.
As the argument escalated, Danielle tried to attract attention from passing motorists. Over 30 vehicles went by, but no one stopped. As the men continued to fight, it appeared that a younger and stronger Stephen had managed to defeat Noy.
It was a busy lunchtime on a Sunday. I think possibly Brands Hatch, which was nearby, the racing circuit might have been on. There was a lot of traffic about.
Instead of leaving, instead of just going, he goes back to his vehicle, to the passenger side, and comes back as Stephen's coming back into the rascal van with what we now know is a knife. Danielle is screaming at Stephen, he's got a knife, Steve.
Stephen turned away to walk away, and the man went back and got a knife.
And the next thing you know, he's stabbed by Kenneth Noy, fatally in the heart.
Noy twice plunged the knife into Stephen's body, puncturing his heart and liver. With the knife still in his hand, Kenny Noy got back into his vehicle and drove off at speed. Stephen had collapsed in Danielle's arms, covered in blood. The violent argument had lasted no more than a few minutes.
The only person who had the presence of mind to think about getting the registration number of the Land Rover Discovery was indeed Stephen.
With Stephen dying in her arms, a distressed Danielle phoned for an ambulance, and then Stephen's father.
When Danielle phoned me, I just went into total panic mode. I don't even remember driving to the roundabout. I just got in the car and went. Just got there and I see Danielle, and she was as white as a sheet. She was really, really white, pale, and she was shaking like a leaf. So I sat her in the car and I went over to Stephen and, yeah.
This vicious attack had happened just 5 minutes from Stephen's home. Paramedics quickly arrived on the scene, but they were too late.
I just looked at him and just knew he was dead. He was as white as anything, and I just knew he was dead. And they knew he was dead. That's an image that's actually burnt into my head. I can still see him laying there. I was numb. My body just felt totally numb. If anyone had said to me, if you were to see your son lying in the road and you knew he was dead, how would you react? I'd have said I'd have gone hysterical. I was as calm as anything. I suppose something just takes over, doesn't it? The adrenaline just takes over.
Ken drove back home to tell Tony.
Just as I'd got home, he rushed out the house and said to me, just get in the car. And I see Danielle was sitting in the front, so I got in the back with the two girls, not knowing what it was. And I always remember looking at Danielle, and she was staring straight ahead. Her face was as white as snow. And I knew by my husband's panic that something was wrong. And I remember my husband was driving frantically, and he said to me, Stephen's been stabbed. I just felt my heart was going to come out of my chest. It was just thumping and thumping, and I just couldn't understand, what was going on. I remember phoning my son. I was panicking, and I thought, I've got to phone the two little girls' mum to tell them to meet us at the hospital because I didn't want them to be there.
Danielle just sat there as quiet as anything. He's never said a word. Never said a word. And to that day, I've never ever spoke to Danielle what happened. She's never ever told me. I've never asked her. I don't think I could put her through it.
We went into a small room and we all stood there just waiting for news.
I knew Stephen was dead, but I couldn't tell her. I just couldn't tell her.
The doctor came in and he told us that they couldn't save our Stephen. He'd died. I couldn't speak, I couldn't do anything. I just remember feeling numb. Everything was so normal that morning, and something like that just didn't seem real. And I couldn't believe that my Stephen could have died. I just wanted to be with him, and they did allow us to go and see him. And I remember holding his hand, and, you know, I don't know how I felt. I just felt numb. I still can't believe that it was him laying there. I can't think how my husband must have felt because he actually saw him. I was spared that, but I wish I'd have been with him though, because it'd be nice as a mother to be with him at that time.
But the one thing I always stuck in my mind, I can never remember seeing any blood. I can never remember seeing any blood at all. And he must have been covered in blood, quite truthful. Don't remember, it must have blinked out.
And then all of a sudden there's all these people around you, because a lot of Stephen's friends had heard it on the news. They was all up at the pub, waiting for him to arrive, and that's when they got the devastating news. And naturally they all rushed over to us, our family. We had to phone family and friends that were close. When your child leaves the house, you wave them goodbye, but you never think you're not going to see them again.
Just yards from the M25 motorway, a murder hunt is underway after what appears to have been an horrific attack of so-called road rage.
A man's been stabbed to death after an argument with another driver. Police are describing the attack
Stephen
as a
Cameron
case of
from Swanley was killed in front of his girlfriend during an argument on a motorway slip road.
Danielle, whose surname isn't being released by the police, had been engaged to Stephen for 6 months.
As news of the tragedy started to break across the country, Kent police had the task of finding Stephen's killer. They mounted Operation Quern.
It was one of the biggest criminal investigations in terms of resources for the Kent police that we've ever had. We had something like in excess of 30 witnesses who had been using the motorway, that junction, at the time, and each of them saw different parts of what happened. Danielle, of course, saw everything that happened. Out of all the witnesses that we had that saw, if not all the incident, but part of the incident, none of them got the whole registration number. None of them. The best we could do was really say it was an L-registered Land Rover Discovery. The colours were ranging from 5 different colours. It was a metallic vehicle. Perhaps the way the sun was shining on the vehicle that day, it wasn't too clear what colour it might have been. But in the end, we were in a very difficult position because there were so many different and conflicting numbers given to us.
Despite Stephen's dying words of warning to remember the number plate, the criminal had fled the scene quickly. The police couldn't get any leads from witnesses, and the hope that cameras in the area may have picked up vital information also had to be discounted.
There was someone out there that had stabbed Stephen, and I wanted them caught.
Although we had witnesses who could say what happened, Nobody identified the person, no one knew who he was, and we were in a very difficult position because we didn't have any forensic evidence that would link a suspect to the scene. There is a CCTV camera at that junction, and on that particular day, the 19th of May, it was not working.
With no forensic evidence and no CCTV, Kent police were struggling to identify the M25 killer.
The man disappeared in what we knew was an L-registered Land Rover Discovery. Difficulty you had was, of course, we didn't have the entire registration number. The police national computer showed 18,000 plus L-registered Land Rover Discoveries, and they're only the legitimate ones that were registered in the UK. But when you spoke to the witnesses, we had about 5 different colours. The colours ranged from green to maroon to blue to grey to black. Very soon we realised that we were going to find it very difficult to find that particular vehicle. If you don't have that significant lead for a named person within the first 48, 72 hours, you know it's going to be an uphill task.
With no vehicle registration number, Kent police were struggling to identify the killer. Had Kenny Noy managed to get away with the brutal attack? 2 months on from his murder, Stephen's funeral was held near to his home at St Mary's Church in Swanley. Friends and family gathered to pay their respects and say their final goodbye.
We had a house full of people and we both felt lonely. Well, you just try and keep yourself going, trying to be strong. I was trying to be strong for Tony. Tony was trying to be strong for us, for me. But you just go through the motions of life, don't you?
At the time, you're numb. I was doing things, don't remember what I was doing. It was as though I was standing up on the ceiling looking down at everybody.
After Stephen died, I tried to get on with my life the best I could. It was very, very difficult. I just couldn't work anymore. I needed a nervous breakdown. I just couldn't face going to work. I couldn't cope with work. If it hadn't been for Tony, I don't know what I'd have done because she was an absolute brick.
I thought the person that would have done it would have been a random thing. Stephen had a van load of tools. He would never have used them. And as for carrying a knife, he would never have thought. I never carry a knife in my car. It didn't frighten me where the family was concerned, but it did worry me that he must be a villain or on drugs or some sort of evil person that was out there would use a knife. Because I know that Stephen would never have done it. He would have fought the fight, but he would never have stabbed anyone or killed anybody.
The grieving family's focus turned once more to the police investigation and finding the M25 killer.
A Land Rover travelling at speed overtook the van Stephen was in. When both vehicles stopped at traffic lights, he and the other driver began arguing. Then after a fight, Stephen was fatally stabbed. The ferocity of the attack has shocked police.
Why did this occur? Why would someone want to use such extreme violence to which is, after all, a fairly minor incident compared to some of the things we have to deal with?
There was lots of points where you think that he isn't going to get caught, he isn't going to get found. And that was the worst part, not knowing where he was. We wanted him caught. For Stephen's sake, we would have gone to the ends of the world for that to happen.
I did start to question if they would actually catch him in my own mind. I used to phone up Nick Biddis, the superintendent, and beat him up every week on the phone. I used to give him a hard time.
There is always a pressure for us to solve such dreadful crimes. There's pressures both from the police, as it were, the public, the media, and especially the family. I mean, Danielle's lost a fiancé. Ken and Tony, of course, they've lost a son.
Danielle was just 17 years old and Kent Police's key witness. They desperately needed her to help solve the murder.
Danielle was extremely cooperative and wanted, throughout, justice for Stephen and the family and herself, obviously. She was always available for me to interview her or to get some information if there was anything, and I always kept regular contact with her, with Ken and Tony Cameron.
Danielle's emotions gave me the strength because I knew I had to help her. It was a sort of a motherly instinct, if you like, and I felt I had to be strong for her, to see someone you love stabbed to death and die in your arms, especially because she was so young and she was so hurt by it all.
Danielle provided the police with a description of the vehicle and Stephen's killer, whilst intelligence was beginning to shed some light on the identity of the Land Rover owner.
There was information that came in relation to local criminals, which is not unusual in a murder inquiry. Kenneth Noy was the sort of guy that wouldn't hide away and would be part of his local community, be seen. It was suggested to us that he disappeared.
This key piece of intelligence shocked those involved.
I couldn't imagine anyone that would have gone back and got a knife, so I obviously thought it was some sort of villain to do something like that and to do it and run and not show any remorse. It might be road rage, but to me it was murder. We never for a moment imagined that he would have been there to have murdered Stephen. It was 1,000,000 to 1 chance that he would meet such a criminal.
We were extremely surprised to think that somebody of Kenneth Noy's professional criminal standard would get involved in such a crime. But of course he's disappeared, so we need to look at it.
I didn't believe it. First off, I just could not believe it. A person with his stature in the criminal world at 1:20 of a Sunday afternoon would do such a stupid thing in broad daylight in front of loads of people. Because he's a person who's well known in the area. I just didn't believe it.
But Kenny Noy had realised the enormity of his crime. After stabbing Stephen Cameron to death, he had raced back to his home, where he made a number of frantic calls, packed a suitcase with cash, and left.
Within 24 hours of the murder, his phone went dead. His mobile phone went dead. And of course, we had no means of finding out what communication he may have been using. Clearly he was using something, but we didn't have any way of monitoring it. We obviously searched his house. His associates and friends and his family claimed they hadn't seen him or he'd gone. Don't know where he was, but he'd had nothing to do with such a crime. Nobody would tell us anything. Nobody knew anything. Hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. He just disappeared off the face of the earth.
With the help of his underworld contacts, Noy was whisked across the channel by helicopter, fleeing the country.
We knew he had a criminal background. He had friends in the criminal world that would help him to stay away, and we knew he would have all these things to help him.
He was desperate to cover his tracks and raise as little suspicion as possible.
We then soon realised that Kenneth Noy not only had disappeared, but the Land Rover Discovery that he had been driving has disappeared. There was another, what we called a doppelganger vehicle, had been stuck on his driveway. This vehicle, which looked exactly the same colour and type of the one that we were looking for, was bought for cash, and that vehicle landed up on Kenneth Noy's driveway. I think it was put there so as if anybody was casually passing by to say that, you know, Kenneth Noy's disappeared, but his vehicle's still on his driveway.
Very quickly, the press discovered the identity of the prime suspect and took a renewed interest in the story.
The press found out that we were looking to try and find Kenneth Noy, who was well known in media circles, and therefore it was a good story, sells papers.
I think the police knew or thought it was Kenneth Noy for about 2 weeks after Stephen died. And they were just looking for him. But I don't think they wanted it broadcast.
I didn't really want his name mentioned at all because I knew that it could potentially harm any fair trial. No matter who the defendant is, they're entitled to a fair trial. And the next thing you know, it's on the Sunday papers, pictures, everything. Kent Police are after Kenneth Noy in relation to the M25 murders. Does anybody know where he is?
I found out Noy was the chief suspect when I bought the News of the World one Sunday morning, in which they was totally outrageous. They shouldn't have done that.
I suppose what I could say was it could have been as a result of the public knowing that, of course, made people aware and kept it in the minds of the public, kept the story and the case going.
The case was generating huge amounts of media interest. Reported sightings of Noy started coming in.
We had sightings of Kenneth Noy, or people who thought they'd seen Kenneth Noy, from all over the world. We went from Russia to Brazil. He'd gone to South America to have his face changed. Kenneth Noy is dead, definitely dead. And I said, unless I'll see his dead body and I have his fingerprints off it, I won't believe it. But there were sightings all over the place. I'm surprised he wasn't seen on the moon.
2 years into the murder investigation, Kent Police finally got a major breakthrough. They received reports that Noy was residing in Spain.
Noy kept a very low profile and, of course, changed his identity with a new passport in the name of Green. His lifestyle was one where he was living in a very remote house. He would be drinking in bars. He was keeping himself to himself, but clearly wasn't a hermit.
The police needed to confirm that the sightings were indeed that of Kenneth James Noy. But media intrusion into the investigation was making things difficult.
The problem I had was the minute I sent any officers abroad, it would only be 24, most 48 hours before the press found out. Eventually, I ran it as a secret inquiry. I sent the officers out there with the remit, all I need you to do is to go out there and see if you can see this guy and tell me whether it's Kenneth Noy. Don't forget that in 1984, Kenneth Noy had killed a police officer in the grounds of his house at West Kingsdown, and I've sent 2 officers out with absolutely no backup to a foreign country to see if they can find this man and identify him.
With their mission outlined, the undercover surveillance officers tracked Noy down to a bar.
Those officers actually knew Kenneth Noy because of obviously his previous convictions, and they gave me a positive response. It's definitely him.
It was a big major breakthrough, but it was sort of opening wounds up because 2 years on we were, you know, settling down a little bit.
But bringing Kenneth Noy to justice was by no means straightforward.
We still hadn't got either any forensic evidence or anybody actually identifying Kenneth Noy as the person who stabbed Stephen Cameron. The bottom line was that in order to link him with the crime on the 19th of May, I needed Danielle to identify him.
She actually was the only one that actually looked him in the eyes and saw him that day.
It was now up to Danielle to bring Stephen's killer to justice. But 2 years after the stabbing, would Danielle be able to positively identify her fiancé's killer?
The identification out in Spain was, in my view, the most significant point of the whole investigation. Clearly, if she didn't identify the person out there, who we knew was Kenneth Noy, as the person who had killed her fiancé, Stephen Cameron, then the whole case in terms of Kenneth Noye would have fallen apart. And I kept regular contact with Danielle, told her, you may have to go somewhere outside this country to try and identify the person responsible.
When the police came round to see us and inform us that Danielle had actually been taken away on a plane to identify the suspect, it came as a shock because we had no idea that they were that close to catching him.
He didn't tell us where. He just said Danielle was on the plane as I speak to you at the moment. We think we found him. I was elated. Cried my eyes out.
Oh, I was really concerned. I was really worried about her because I knew she would be upset. I knew she'd be frightened.
Of course, there were dangers in doing that. There were dangers for her welfare, so much so that when we eventually decided that she'd have to go out there to do this, I decided to do it in as public an area as possible. What we were trying to avoid was, if you like, a one-to-one situation. Fortunately for us, he went out to a restaurant where it was absolutely packed. Danielle was able to look through a window and she was positive in her identification.
Nick Bidis phoned us and said, we've got him, she's ID'd him, it's him.
It's about 2 years after Stephen died, which was an eternity, but they actually found him.
We were then able, as a result of that identification, to obtain a warrant for his arrest in the UK.
Within 24 hours, Kent police were granted a warrant for Kenny Noye's arrest.
Kenneth Noye was a creature of habit, and he was a person who frequented much the same bars in the Barbat area. And he was located in the particular bar where he was sitting outside on the seafront, and he was accompanied by a young lady. The Spanish authorities were actually fully briefed as to Kenneth Noye's previous convictions and his previous history as regards his violence towards officers. And they, I can assure you, took no chances when it came to arresting him. He was very quickly grabbed, immobilised, handcuffed and taken into custody.
With Noye arrested, the process for his extradition back to the UK began, a lengthy process that would take a year to complete.
It was for the British courts to decide whether it was being dealt with in accordance with the law, and they granted it, and he was duly extradited 3 years almost to the day that the crime had been committed. Initially, he claimed he had nothing to do whatsoever with the incident on the M25 on the 19th of May and knew nothing about the murder of Stephen Cameron, and that the British police were after him because of him being acquitted of murder of a police officer. That was his claim. Once he was brought back to the country, he then accepted that it was indeed him that had killed Stephen Cameron on the 19th of May, but that it was in self-defence.
He had to hold his hands up. Yes, I was there, it was me, but it was self-defence. But it was never self-defence. Stephen wasn't carrying a knife, he was one carrying a knife.
4 years after killing Stephen Cameron, Kenneth Noye stood trial at the Old Bailey. He pleaded not guilty.
It's very important to go to the trial and see him face the music and see justice done.
The first time I saw Kenneth Noye in court, I wanted him to be dead for killing my son.
Stabbing him twice, he intended to kill him. And I just wanted justice for Stephen. That's all I've ever wanted.
When he gave evidence at court, he said that he believed he had to leave the scene, leave the country, because the police would make sure that he got convicted of a crime he never committed, and therefore he wasn't going to hang around and wait to be arrested.
He was trying to make out that Stephen was the violent person, that it was in self-defence. He even said in court that he thought Stephen was going to throw him over the bridge and all sorts of silly things he came out with.
But it was Danielle's witness statement that would be of crucial importance.
The key part to this case, and the one that linked it all together, was the identification of Kenneth Noy by Danielle Cable. Forensically, there was nothing there, and unless we had somebody who could identify the person who stuck the knife into Stephen, then we would never have got a conviction.
Part of his defence was that he had been identified unlawfully by Danielle. It was proven that it wasn't. Danielle was a key witness, and the one thing she always said was that his eyes, evil eyes, and that's what she see when she went out to Spain and see him, his evil eyes. That's when she knew it was him.
Kenneth Noy was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Stephen Cameron. He would have to serve a minimum term of 16 years before he could be considered for parole.
At the time, I felt elated that he'd been found guilty, but I felt deflated that life didn't mean life, because he got 16 years. To me, he should never come out. He doesn't deserve to be out. He showed no remorse. I feel that Stephen got justice because we caught the person that did it, but I don't feel that there's justice, the fact that he's going to one day walk free and have some sort of life.
I don't know where she is now. I don't know what her identity is, and neither do I need to know. All I want to make sure is that she can get on and lead the rest of her life in a happy way and a content way.
We haven't seen Danielle since 1998, and we absolutely loved Danielle. She was a wonderful little girl. She really was a wonderful little girl, and we both miss her.
She was a very brave girl to have done what she did, because she could have easily turned around and said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not going to get involved in it because it's likely to be a problem." But I think she's a very brave girl and should be given all credit for that.
Me personally, I think the law now should be that anyone who carries a knife, is caught carrying a knife, should be put in prison. It's treated totally different to gun crimes, which I think people die with knives and people die with guns. Why is it treated totally different to gun crimes? Stephen would have been a fantastic father, absolutely fantastic father. We'd have had fantastic grandchildren with him, which we've been totally denied by an evil man.
You live your life, but you're not happy. Inside, your heart's broken. No one can mend that.
Our son Michael can't even talk about Stephen. He can't face that his brother's dead. You know, but yeah, everyone's got on with their life, which, you know, we've had to get on with our life. You have to, don't you? Life goes on. But you don't stop mourning, you don't stop missing Stephen. I miss him every day, all day.